Hello, and thank you for joining me in this video. This will be our second last video on my series of talks on covenant. I hope you have been enjoying the video so far, and I trust that you have been tremendously blessed by the Word of God. In this video, I will be talking about the Davidic Covenant. But before going into the Davidic Covenant, it is important for us to set the scene for the arrival of David. So we will start with the book of Judges. During the time when the people occupied the Promised Land, Israel was just a federation of tribes. And this federation was essentially a theocratic community. What it means is the people of Israel had no king. God was their king. Before the time of Samuel, God raised judges to rule Israel and to help Israel whenever they got into trouble. The first judge was Othniel. He was sent by God when the people cried to God for help. Now let's take a look at Judges chapter 3. But when they cried out to the Lord, he raised up for them a deliverer, Othniel, son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother, who saved them. Now, if you remember the vicious cycle that I've shown you in the past two videos, God showered the people with blessings. The people became complacent and they started to do things their way. Then they got themselves into trouble and then they asked God for help. God intervened. And this whole cycle keep on going again and again and again, especially in the book of Judges. Whenever the people got themselves into trouble, they shouted to God for help, and God would send them a judge. Now, according to the Bible, Israel had a total of 14 judges, and they were all given to Israel when they were being oppressed by the enemies. Samuel was the last judge before Israel had a king. Before Samuel, the judge was Eli. Eli had two very evil sons, and they both died. Let's take a look at the story. Eli's sons were scoundrels. They had no regard for the Lord. This sin of the young man was very great in the Lord's sight, for they were treating the Lord's offering with contempt. So the two evil sons died, and shortly after that, Eli also died. After Eli's death, Samuel became the judge of Israel. But Samuel did something that was wrong. Can you imagine? Even one of the greatest prophets could do something wrong. Now, what did Samuel do that was wrong? He appointed his two sons to succeed him, but the two sons were evil in the sight of God. Let's take a look at the story. When Samuel grew old, he appointed his two sons as Israel's leaders. The name of his firstborn was Joel, and the name of his second was Abijah, and they served at Beersheba. But his sons did not follow his ways. They turned aside after dishonest gain and accepted bribes and perverted justice. So his two sons were like the two sons of Eli. But what exactly did Samuel do that was wrong? You see, in Eli's case, Eli did not appoint his two sons to succeed him, but Samuel did. So Samuel was trying to set up a dynastic line for himself, which was not supposed to be the case. Remember, God will only raise a judge of his own will when Israel needed one. But Samuel was trying to set up a dynasty for his own family. Ironically, just at the time when Samuel tried to establish a dynastic line, Israel rejected him and instead asked for a king to be appointed. So all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah. They said to him, "You are old, and your sons do not follow your ways. Now appoint a king to us, such as all the other nations have." Notice the highlighted words. Israel asked for a king not because they wanted a king, but simply because all other nations had a king. They were comparing themselves to all other nations. Because other nations had a king, they also wanted a king. Now, I often ask this question to the students. Is life totally fair? Not surprisingly, everyone said life can never be totally fair. But I am of the opinion that life is actually totally fair. It only becomes unfair when we start to compare. And as human, we will always compare. If you ask the only child at home, does daddy or mommy love you? He will most likely say yes, because he is the only child. But with the arrival of the second and the third child, that's where you have problem in the family. The children will start to compare. How come daddy loves sister more? How come mommy loves brother more? I'm the middle one, nobody loves. The problem with all of us is this. We will always compare ourselves with someone who have more than us. We will never compare ourselves with someone who has less than us. So Israel wanted a king because someone else had more than them. But Israel already had the best king. They had God as their king. But they never saw that. Does this sound familiar? The problem with all of us is that we see how other people are being blessed, but we never saw our own blessings. Then what happened? We get jealous and we start to complain that life is not fair. So God allowed Israel to have a king. He told Samuel this in 1 Samuel 8. Listen to all that the people are saying to you. It is not you they have rejected, but they have rejected me as their king, as they have done from the day I brought them out of Egypt until this day, forsaking me and serving other gods, so they are doing to you. So God said, Samuel, Israel did not reject you. They have rejected me as their king. You know, about 2,000 years later, Jesus said the same thing in John chapter 15. He said, if the world hates you, keep in mind that it hated me first. The world didn't hate you, but the world hated me first. Listen to the tone used by God in 1 Samuel, when he said that the people did not reject Samuel, but the people had rejected him as their king. How do you think God feels? Sad, betrayed, helpless, disgruntled? Just imagine if you had done so much for someone, but that person did not show you any gratitude at all. How would you feel? Here is the lesson that we can learn. Our God is so gracious that even when he was rejected by the people whom he loved, he still remembered the covenant and the promises that he made to his people. Just like Jesus, even when he was rejected by his own people, he died for them. So God allowed a king to be appointed for Israel, and it was here that Saul entered the scene. Now, since we are talking about the Davidic Covenant in this video, we will not go into detail to talk about Saul. But we will use King Saul to set the scene for our discussion on David. To cut the long story short, Saul became the first king of Israel, and going back to the vicious cycle, when Saul was blessed by God, he became complacent. Saul did two things that were wrong. The first, Saul usurped the priesthood from Samuel. When Israel was attacked by the Philistines, Saul was very afraid. So he asked Samuel, who was at that time the priest, to offer sacrifices to God. That was the job of the priest, to offer sacrifices to God. But Saul became impatient when Samuel didn't show up at the time appointed. So what did he do? Saul went ahead to offer the sacrifice himself. He was not supposed to do that because that job was reserved for the priest. Let's take a look at the story quickly. As for Saul, he was still in Gilgal, and all the people followed him trembling. Then he waited 7 days according to the time set by Samuel. But Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and the people were scattered from him. So Saul said, bring a burnt offering and peace offering here to me, and he offered the burnt offering. So Saul offered the burnt offering when he was not supposed to do so. He was impatient. Saul should have waited for Samuel. If he had waited just a little while more, Samuel would have come. In fact, Samuel was already on his way. He was just a little bit late. So if Saul had waited for a while more, everything would have been okay. But Saul was impatient. Have you been impatient with God? Have you tried praying for something, and when God didn't give you an answer immediately, you decided to do things your own way? And then when things didn't quite work out, you got upset with God and started to complain that God didn't help you. Just be patient and God will show up. Now let's find out what happened when Samuel showed up. Now it happened as soon as he had finished presenting the burnt offering that Samuel came, and Saul went out to meet him that he might greet him. And Samuel said, "What have you done?" Does this sound familiar to you? God asked Adam, "Where are you?" And God asked Cain, "What have you done?" Now, I've explained the reason why God had asked these questions, even though he knew the answers. It was because God wanted to give his people a chance to come clean with him. But how did Saul respond? "When I saw that the people were scattered from me, and that you did not come within the days appointed, and that the Philistines gathered together at Michmash, then I said, the Philistines will now come down on me at Gilgal, and I have not made supplication to the Lord. Therefore, I felt compelled and offered a burnt offering." Now, does this ring a bell? Saul said, "When I saw that the people were scattered from me, and that you, Samuel, did not come." Adam said, "The woman you created told me to eat from the tree." So Adam blamed the woman, Saul blamed the people. Adam blamed God for giving him the woman, Saul blamed Samuel for turning up late. Suddenly, we go back to the Garden of Eden all over again. Now, Samuel reprimanded Saul for his foolishness. "You have done foolishly," Samuel said to Saul. "You have not kept the commandment of the Lord your God, which he commanded you. For now the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever. But now your kingdom shall not continue. The Lord has sought for himself a man after his own heart. And the Lord has commanded him to be commander over his people, because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you." So God said Saul will not be the right king. Someone else will be the king. This sets the scene for David to be the next king. I have said many times that my goal in this series of talks is to help you to learn how to see Jesus in all the Bible stories in the Old Testament. In many, many ways, David was a type of Christ. For example, the Bible talks about how David, while tending the flock, saw a bear or a lion carried away a sheep. David went after the animal and killed it. Now, let's take a look at the story. But David said to Saul, "Your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I ran after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it, and killed it." Does this sound familiar to you? That David would risk his life to rescue one sheep. In Luke 15, Jesus told his disciples a parable. "Suppose one of you has 100 sheep and loses one of them. Doesn't he leave the 99 in the open country and go after the lost sheep until he finds it? And when he finds it, he joyfully puts it on his shoulders and goes home." What was presented in 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 34 to 35, and Luke 15, verse 3 to 5, is the same picture. David entered the scene in a dramatic way. We know this story very well. David fought the giant Goliath. Goliath was a big giant, and the Bible said that David was just a short, timid young boy. There was no way for him to fight the giant. But he did, and he won. Goliath was actually set up by God to promote David. Sometimes when you are faced with a Goliath in your life, so to speak, the challenge you face may seem to destroy you. Just like how when David stood in front of Goliath, it seemed like Goliath would destroy David. But take heart. These challenges that you have in life are not there to destroy you. They are there to promote you. When you are going through difficulties in life, you may not understand. But if you stay faithful, God will bring you out of that difficulty and will make you a better person. I gave an example in my last video about a student of mine who was addicted to gambling. I am sure there were moments in his life where he felt there was no way for him to pay off his debts. He was facing a Goliath in his life, so to speak. Sometimes these challenges we face in life could be our own doing because we have made poor choices in life. But God can turn your mess into a message. Just like how this student of mine who has stayed faithful to God throughout the challenging time is now able to help others who are addicted to gambling. His message is now featured in many social medias. So long as you are still breathing, your dream is still alive. So don't give up because of all these challenges in life. Now, David, we know the story, he defeated Goliath. And after his victory, the people of Israel praised him. And that was when Saul became jealous. When the victorious Israelite army was returning home after David had killed the Philistine, women from all the towns of Israel came out to meet King Saul. They sang and danced for joy with timbrels and cymbals. This was their song. Saul has killed his thousands and David his 10,000s. This made Saul very angry. What is this, he said? They credit David with 10,000s and me with only thousands? Next, they will be making him the king. So from that time on, Saul kept a jealous eye on David. Because of Saul's jealousy, he ended up doing all the wrong things. There's a lesson for all of us to learn here. Now, I think it is perfectly normal for Saul to be jealous, or in our case, it is perfectly normal for us to feel insecure at times. We all do. But it is our response to our jealousy and insecurity that will make the difference. I always tell my students in class, as a leader, it is the duty of all managers, all leaders to make the staff shine. But the reality is when the staff can do better than them, the managers will feel insecure. I've seen many such managers. You know what? Sadly, such jealousies happen among our church leaders as well. Now, those who have been actively serving in a church will know what I mean. Church politics is very real. When one ministry grows, another ministry will get jealous. Can I tell you this? You can only be a true leader when you let others shine. I can only be a good teacher when my students do well. Your subordinate's success will be a reflection of your leadership. And also remember this, when your subordinates outshine you, be prepared that many people will start to talk about your subordinates and you. And sometimes the things they say can be very hurtful. As in this case, the women were praising David and not Saul. Now, how you respond will determine the kind of leader you are. In here, we see that Saul had responded in a way that was unbecoming of a leader. But I really think the focus here is not on Saul's response, but it is more about David's response. David responded to Saul's jealousy with grace. You know, I've always wondered, how could David be such a big person? He had many opportunities to take revenge, to put things right, but he didn't. he trusted God. He was able to let go of all the wrong things done to him. No wonder David was called the man after God's heart. I think the key here is to let go. Now, if you can't let go of all the small things in life, then how can you let go of the biggest things in life? Guess what is the biggest thing we need to let go in life? I think the biggest thing we need to let go in life is life itself. And death, we all need to let that go. That's why death can be so painful to many. Because on their deathbed, they still can't let go of their hurts, their unforgiveness, their money, their anger, etc., etc., etc. We should all learn to be like David. Now, David sinned. We know that. And that's a very popular story that we all know, a familiar story that we all know. David sinned with Bathsheba. But you know what? When David sinned, he didn't blame anyone but himself. What happened was God told David to go into battle with the Ammonites. Now, David, as the king, was supposed to lead his men in the battle. But instead, he decided to stay in Jerusalem. He asked Joab to go. When he alone stayed behind, he met Bathsheba and he sinned. He had an affair with Bathsheba. She became pregnant, and to conceal his own sin, David planned to kill Uriah, who was Bathsheba's husband. God sent a prophet to confront David. Let's take a look at it. So the Lord sent Nathan to David. This is what the Lord God of Israel says. I anointed you king over Israel and rescued you from Saul. I gave you your master Saul's house and his wives. I gave you the house of Israel and Judah. And if this weren't enough, I would have given you even more. Why did you despise my word by doing what I considered evil? You had Uriah the Hittite killed in battle. You took his wife as your wife. You used the Ammonites to kill him. So warfare will never leave your house because you despised me and took the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your wife. Now let's take a look at David's response, shall we? Then David said to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. Notice that David was very different from other people. He did not blame anyone but himself. Unlike all that had come before him, David owned up to his own mistakes and sought forgiveness. In Psalm 5, David wrote, have mercy on me, O God, according to your unfailing love, according to your great compassion, blot out my transgressions, wash away all my iniquity, and cleanse me from my sin. David did not blame anyone. He came clean with God. He confessed to God. And because of this, God honored him and God established a covenant with him. Let's take a look at it. When your days are over and you go to be with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, one of your own sons, and I will establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build a house for me, and I will establish his throne forever. God said, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you when you die, one of your own sons, and I will establish his kingdom. So God said one of David's sons will succeed David after David's death. Now, who was David's son who would succeed him after his death? We all know that. It was Solomon. Now, here is where I would like to encourage all of us to please study the Bible instead of just reading it like a bedtime story. If we study this verse very carefully, we will know that God was actually not talking about Solomon. Let's take a look at how Solomon became king. King David said, call in Zadok the priest, Nathan the prophet, and Benaiah, son of Jehoiada. When they came before the king, he said to them, take your Lord's servants with you and have Solomon my son mow my own mule and take him down to Gihon. There have Zadok the priest and Nathan the prophet anoint him king over Israel. So Zadok the priest took the horn of oil from the sacred pan and anointed Solomon. Then they sounded the trumpet, and all the people shouted, "Long live King Solomon." By the end of 1 King chapter 1, Solomon became the king. That was 1 King chapter 1. Now let's go to 1 King chapter 2, verse 1. When the time drew near for David to die, he gave a charge to Solomon his son. Okay? This means Solomon became king before David died. Now we go back to 1 Chronicles 17, where God established a covenant with David. God said, after David's death, he would raise up a son for David who would establish his kingdom. After David's death. But Solomon became king before David's death. Now, God is perfectly accurate about the things he said. He is not like us. We can be flippant, we can be casual with our words. I'm guilty of that. And sometimes we don't even want to take responsibility for the things we have said. But not our God. He told David, when your days are over and you go to be with your ancestors, this means after David's death. Then he went on to say, your son will establish your kingdom. God was not talking about Solomon because Solomon became the king before David died. You know, for a long time, I got these two verses wrong. I thought that God was talking about Solomon because Solomon succeeded David. But if you were to study the Bible carefully, God could not possibly be talking about Solomon here. Now, who is the son God is talking about here? I submit to you that God was establishing Jesus' kingship and not Solomon's, because Solomon became a king before David's death. Sadly, Solomon was a good king for only a while. If you remember the vicious cycle I spoke about many times in the series of talks, God blessed Solomon abundantly. He became the wisest man and the wealthiest man. And then what happened? He became complacent. He did all the wrong things toward the end of his life. He broke the Deuteronomy laws. Let's take a quick look at that. In Deuteronomy chapter 17, the king, moreover, must not acquire great numbers of horses for himself or make the people return to Egypt to get more of them. For the Lord has told you, you are not to go back that way again. He must not take many wives or his heart will be led astray. Let's summarize all these in the table and see how Solomon broke every one of the laws here. Number one, you must not acquire great number of horses. 1 Kings chapter 4, Solomon had 4,000 stalls for chariot horses and 12,000 horses. Second law, must not make the people return to Egypt. In 1 Kings chapter 3, Solomon made an alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and married his daughter. The third law, you must not take many wives. In 1 Kings chapter 11, he had 700 wives of royal birth and 300 concubines, and his wives led him astray. So Solomon broke many laws. We can now compare David and Solomon. To make it easier for you, let me present this in a picture. So we can say that David rose from rag to riches in an ascending order. So he started off as an unknown poor shepherd boy. He became a monarch of the land. He was repentant and became spiritually rich. This is in an ascending order. Whereas Solomon was the other way around. He fell from grace to become spiritually poor in a descending order. So God was angry with Solomon. And what was his punishment? The kingdom will be divided. The Lord became angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord. the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. Although he had forbidden Solomon to follow other gods, Solomon did not keep the Lord's command. So the Lord said to Solomon, since this is your attitude and you have not kept my covenant and my decrees, which I commanded you, I will most certainly tear the kingdom away from you and give it to one of your subordinates. So the kingdom was divided. 10 tribes pledged their allegiance to Egypt and formed the northern kingdom, known as Israel, under Jeroboam. 2 tribes, Judah and Benjamin, remained in the southern kingdom, which was called Judah. Now the northern kingdom went into the Assyrian exile, but Assyria later came under attack and was destroyed by the Babylonians. All the 10 tribes of Israel were removed from history. The Jewish people of today are descendants of the southern kingdom. They belong to the tribe of Judah and Benjamin. The other 10 tribes had disappeared from history. The whole of Israel was in exile for 400 years, and at the end of it, a Messiah came. And that will be the talk in my next video, where what was promised to David will come to pass. Let us remind ourselves again, what was that promise? When your days are over and you go to be with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, one of your own sons, and I will establish his kingdom. That after his death, God will raise up a true son of David to establish his kingdom permanently. And that will be Jesus, the new covenant. I hope you have been blessed by today's message. I will see you in the next video when we return to talk about the incarnation of Jesus and the new covenant. Thank you very much for watching, and God bless you.